This is Jay Rogers of Forerunner.com. The Russia-Ukraine crisis. What is the off-ramp? Okay, so it's been a while since I've done a video on the Russia-Ukraine conference, and what I would like to address in a very short video is what is the off-ramp for the United States? I wanted to start by showing a short clip. This is President Joe Biden in Helsinki last month. It says right on there, July 13th, 2023. It's from a few weeks ago. And this is right after the NATO summit in Helsinki, Finland. What Ukraine had hoped to do is to launch a counteroffensive in the spring or in June, and then to take back enough land to encourage NATO either to let Ukraine join NATO early, start the peace negotiations with Russia, or to get more support on what they've done on the battlefield. That didn't happen, and I'm going to go over that after I analyze this. But this is President Biden in his joint news conference.
Those comments could motivate Putin to keep the war going or discourage him from entering peace negotiations? And is there a serious risk that this war could drag on for years? And do you see any path toward the war ending with Putin still in power?
First of all, no one can join NATO while a war is going on, where a NATO nation is being attacked, because that guarantees that we're in a war, and we're in a third world war. So that it's not about whether or not they should or shouldn't join. It's about when they can join, and they will join NATO. The issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he could end the war tomorrow. He could just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine anyway, he's already lost that war.
Just on the question of a concern about going on for years, is there a possibility that there's a stalemate and it's become...
I'm sorry?
The question of whether the war could go on for years, is there a possibility there's a stalemate and it can continue for quite some time?
Well, I don't think the war can go on for years for two reasons. Number one, I don't think that that Russians could maintain the war forever, number one, in terms of their resources and capacity. Number two, I think that there is going to be a circumstance where eventually President Putin is going to decide it's not in the interest of Russia, economically, politically, or otherwise, to continue this war. But I can't predict exactly how that happens. My hope is, and my expectation is, you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive, and that it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line.
And I have a question for the Finnish.
Okay, so that was Joe Biden from a few weeks ago, and I wanted to discuss what this actually means. This was an article that I did back in May, and I'm going to be doing an update to this pretty soon based on what I'm talking about right here. But this is Forerunner.com. This is my website. I've run this since 1996, and you can go there. You can donate if you're interested in helping us with videos, books, different things that we produce. I just want to enlarge this. This is called Russia and Ukraine Conflict, Shifting Media Narratives. And I went over this before, but I just wanted to point out one thing here that I thought was kind of interesting. This is what I call the 4 stages of the shifting media narrative. I said from last year, the end of last summer, that the narrative shift would have 4 stages. First, we would hear over and over again that Ukraine was winning, Russia is losing badly. And then you'd start to hear numbers 2 and 3, which you just heard in this question. The conflict is frozen. Ukraine just needs more arms to win, but this might go on for years. And then now what we're starting to hear more of is it looks like things are going badly for Ukraine, especially in this counteroffensive. And then number 4 is how did that happen? All right, so we're now about in stage 3. We're getting into stage 4. Some people like Joe Biden are clinging desperately to number 2, but notice that what Joe Biden said. Occasionally you find the clown narrative saying Russia's losing badly. Not only did Joe Biden say that Russia's losing badly, but he said Russia has already lost. Okay? Now, how does that make any sense? All right? This is my point. Military intelligence psychological operations work. This is called PSYOPs, or just propaganda. If you can convince enough people with propaganda to believe the narrative over time, but then eventually the narrative collapses when enough evidence mounts up, and that creates cognitive dissonance in the minds of the hearers. They'll suddenly have a what the we were lied to moment. And so here's the problem with the propaganda. How do you keep the PSYOP going in the face of sheer reality that contradicts everything? And the answer is you need to create a contingency clause within the foundation of the false narrative. So what we said last time was that we would start to see more of this. I sent, let's see if I can find this real quick. I'm going to kind of show you some of my emails here. But I sent out an email to some friends a while ago. And what I did was I showed several, oops, let's not do that for right now. Anyway, I showed several articles recently showing how the counteroffensive was failing. So if you could just go to Google and type in counteroffensive failing, you're going to find, Ukraine soldiers slam West, reveal reasons for failure. This is from an Indian newspaper. Website. They're very pro-Russian. This is Bloomberg, which is very pro-Ukrainian. But this is interesting. This is a conversation between Putin and Lukashenko, or Lukashenko, as they Westerners say. And this is just a conversation that they had about why Ukraine's losing. I'm just going to read the subtitles here. The war is to be waged against the entire NATO bloc. The weapons are theirs, mercenaries are already participating, and an important thing, why yesterday is important. The main strategic reserves are involved. This suggests that this thoughtless policy of throwing unprepared people and mercenaries into hell will not lead to anything. But there is no counteroffensive. There is no counteroffensive. What next? And Putin says, no, it's there, it just fails. Lukashenko says it fails, there's no reason. As for foreign mercenaries, they might also suffer significant more losses, big losses, because of his tactics, because of their stupidity, Putin says. Okay, so basically what they're talking about there was that they've begun to, the Russian forces have actually begun to kill a lot of foreign mercenaries that have been thrown into the battle. Okay, so what I want to show you is this. This is another interesting thing. This is from 4 weeks ago, and they asked Biden whether Russia was losing the battle in Ukraine. And what does he say here?
It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home, and he has become a bit of a flyer around the world.
So this is what's known as a Freudian slip. It's when you say something that you don't mean to say, but it suggests an underlying psychological something that's buried in your unconscious, and it just slips out. You were supposed to say one thing, but you end up saying another thing. It's kind of a common thing, some type of innuendo or some type of slip up. This is the beginning of the counteroffensive. So what he meant to say was Russia was losing the war in Ukraine. He said Iraq, which is kind of ironic because, America has lost the war in Iraq and America has lost the war in Afghanistan. America lost the war against Russia in Syria. And now America is losing this proxy war in Ukraine. So this is what's happened. This is the greatest counteroffensive in Ukrainian military history, unless we count the time of the Soviet Union. But since 1992 onwards, since Ukraine had a military, this is their greatest counteroffensive against another country, and this is how it's gone. The plan was they were going to try to break through Russian defenses. There's actually several lines of defenses here. This is the main line, and there's other lines behind that going all back miles. And the goal was to try to find a weak point, and then cut all the way to the Sea of Azov, which is this area down here. And from there, they would be able to launch missiles at Crimea, strike the Kerch Bridge, which they have tried to do a few times, and then basically get Russia to the negotiating table, or drive Russia out of Crimea, which is something which has been said, which I think is kind of ridiculous. So here we are, June 24th, June 25th, and you see there's some back and forth movement. The areas in green are areas that Russia has once occupied, but Ukraine has occupied now. These are areas that have gone back and forth. These blue areas are new areas. And there's basically 3 fronts where Ukraine has had some very limited success. It's up here, close to where the Dnieper River is. This is called the Bradley Square, out of the fact that Ukraine has lost so many Bradley tanks in this area. It's kind of like a square area where they lost a lot of tanks. And so as you can see, we're now to July 18th, July 20th, 21st. And of course, today's date is the 27th. Oops. So they only have up to the 26th. So I was trying to zoom. We can look also at Bakhmut if we want to go all the way back to June. Bakhmut. A couple of things I want to point out. This is the city of Donetsk. The city of Donetsk has been shelled for 8 or 9 years, 9 years since the Donbass, the first war started back in 2014, and for 9 years, Ukrainian forces have launched missile attacks and terrorist attacks into Donetsk. Okay, so the people in Donetsk, they'll go for a period of about 2 months. They'll be shelled daily, and then every 1.5 to 2 months or so, there will be a big barrage of missiles. There'll be civilian casualties and so on. And the area that they're fighting from is called Avdiivka. Okay, so it's very important for the sake of the civilians in Donetsk to get Ukrainians out of Avdiivka. The Russians have made it's basically surrounded on 3 sides. And what the Russians are trying to do is to create a larger salient in the north and the south, like in this direction, and cut off their supplies, hit the supply roads, cut off their supplies so that they can take Avdiivka. If you remember back in the spring, the Russians took Bakhmut, and I'm not going to go all the way back to May, but I will start around May 24th. And oops, go back to about May 24th, and this is what I'll zoom in on this so we can see this a lot better. This was when Russia was concentrating on taking back. Let's go back a little bit further. Actually, go back to May 10th. Okay. At this point, Russia was concentrating on taking back the rest of Bakhmut, which are these right here. Let's see if I can get some. the satellite picture here. Here we go. They were still concentrating on trying to get all of Bakhmut. And at the same time, what the Ukrainians were doing is that they were trying to hit the northern and southern salients, which are the areas where Russia was trying to surround Bakhmut. So you see, even as the Russians were taking block by block each day the rest of Bakhmut, by this point right here where you see this gray area, this is by May 19th, Russia had pretty much taken the city. All right, it was very quick. It was a very quick collapse. But then in the meantime, what Ukraine had done was this. If we go back, they put pressure on these salients, and that was the reason for that was to get Ukrainian troops and personnel out of Bakhmut, because the Russians had these roads under firepower, so they wanted to push the Russians back. And then since that time, what's happened is that in the north and the south, they've tried to do the opposite. They've tried, the same way that the Russians surrounded the Ukrainians in one direction, now the Ukrainians are trying to surround the Russian city of what they now call Artyomovsk, because Artyomovsk is the Russian name of the city of Bakhmut. They're trying to surround that and take back Bakhmut for Ukraine. So you can see that, like, these cities over here, Chazov Yar, and some of these smaller villages and cities, Russia was never able to get that far west. And so what the Ukrainians are doing is they are, in the north and south, they're trying to push Russia so that if they get surrounded, there's Yahidne and Andriivka are the two, or especially Klashivka right here. That's a very important. So you can see as time goes on, this is now June 13th and June 16th and so on, and things move very, very slow. There's a lot of back and forth, but where we're at today, you're going to see in another month, is that the Ukrainians are now threatening this area over here, Soledar, which is a very important city, and also Andriivka and Klashivka. So what will happen eventually is either Russia will have to push them back, or if they surround Bakhmut, the Russians will have to draw from Bakhmut. Now, what does that mean? We were told for months that Bakhmut was not an important city. That's when the Russians were trying to take it. And now that the Ukrainians are trying to take it back, they're looking at it as a great push. But both movements were very slow. And you see that this is where probably the most intense fighting is happening right now. The counteroffensive in the south is kind of stalled, and this is the most intense area of fighting. So here we are, the 21st of July, coming up to the 27th. But this is really the greatest area that Ukraine has been able to take in the counteroffensive, is this little blue area here, and they also have been able to take back the outskirts, like this whole green area and the blue area. Okay, now where Russia has been doing very well is in the north here. I wanted to show you this whole area. I'm going to back up a little bit. And during the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia actually has taken more land than the Ukrainians have. So if we go all the way back to May, this is what has happened since May. Now I'm zoomed out, so this is not going to look like much, but it's several miles that have been taken toward the west. And this did not happen until recently, so I'm going to kind of just scroll through this very quickly. You can see places where Russia started to amass forces. And what they did last fall was they did a massive, so here we are right here. So what they did last fall was they did a massive mobilization, and they say that there are about 100 to 120,000 Russian troops in this area and 900 tanks. So they've taken. So I'll just show you the areas where they took. This is the areas where they took land. And zoomed out, it doesn't seem like that much, but this is very, very important right here, because there's a river called the Oskol River, and they were able to cross that, and now they are establishing what they call a bridgehead or a beachhead on the other side. See, this is what the Russians were able to do. So out to here, this bulge right here. And what they will do now is they will reinforce this area, and then they will, at some point, we don't know when, it could be August, September, they will try to push all the way back and recapture this whole green area, which is area that they withdrew from, Izium especially, and then the area all the way up to Kharkiv. And there's also a possibility that the Russians might invade again from the north, or at least establish a zone that surrounds Kharkiv on 2 or 3 sides. And then the other possibility of what might happen is that Russia might, again, like they did last year in February and March, push toward Kiev, which is here, and this other city called Chernikov or Chernihiv. Okay. Which is this area up here. This is an oblast. So, what's going to happen? What's going to happen at this point is that what you're going to be hearing in the news in the next few months about and I don't want to put a date on it. It could be the next few months. It could be 2024, 2025. Who knows? But at some point, you're going to start to hear a lot of things in the press about, the Ukrainian forces collapsing. The reason why I say that is just simply numbers. Russia is a nation now with these added territories. They're a nation of about 150 million people. Ukraine has actually lost a lot of people. They've gone from being a nation of 43 million down to the low 30s, or even some people say the high 20s. There are a lot of people that fled to Russia, Russian supporters in the very beginning of the war. People don't realize it, but the plurality, or like the country that took the most refugees from the war, is actually Russia. And then second would be Poland, and these are people that are very pro-Western, and then Romania and some other areas there. But Ukraine lost a lot of people, so we're talking about 150 million versus a nation of about 30 million. It's 5 times larger. As of this point, the Russians have 2 to 3 times the number of people mobilized. Their firepower and their equipment, ammunition, missiles, and so on, they're outfiring Ukraine at about a rate of 7-1. Okay, and despite what you may have heard, the side that has lost the most men, either to being killed in battle or just casualties where they're not coming back, is Ukraine, not Russia. It doesn't make any sense if you say that, one side is firing 7 pieces of ammunition for every 1 piece of ammunition, to say that the side that's firing 7 pieces are taking the heaviest casualties. And there have been studies on this. There have been some Russian groups that have gone through and looked at obituaries and graveyards, and they've done like a rough number of how many people that they thought were killed in the first year of the war, like from February through February, and they said it was no more than 20 to 25,000. Now, it's been more since then, but the Ukrainians have probably lost 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times the amount that nobody knows the numbers. If anyone says that they know the exact numbers, they're guessing. And sometimes when they say, like, you might hear like 100,000 dead or 200,000 dead, what they're doing is they're including casualties as well, because when you eliminate someone, you eliminate them in a war. Okay, so the off-ramp is this. The off-ramp is, in the very beginning of the war, what you heard was a piece of misinformation. Putin thought that he was going to take Kiev in 3 days and defeat Ukraine in 3 days. Now, nowhere did Putin ever actually say that. That's what the West said. And they did that to say that basically, okay, Putin may have won this this campaign, but Russia is going to be crushed now with sanctions. They're going to be a pariah nation. Most of the world is going to be against them. And they've repeated that piece of propaganda over and over and over again. And in reality, what's happened is that, and you can read all kinds of articles. Let's look at sanctions. Oops. So have sanctions on Russia worked? All right. Most economists note that the short-term effect of the sanctions was not as serious as first expected. And they're saying that the Russian economy is expected to grow by 0.7%. They're actually going to grow by about 2 to 3%. Sanctions on Russia may not be working. Now we know why. Why are the sanctions on Russia? And are they hurting Russia or are they hurting the West? So this is all article. These are all articles in the last few months. Sanctions on Russia's businesses haven't worked. Are sanctions on Russia working? Are they working? So people were so convinced that they were going to crush the ruble. And in the very beginning that happened. I'll show you what happened with the ruble. The ruble now is worth 11 cents on the dollar. Or excuse me, 1.1 cent on the dollar. And it was as high as 1.6 cents on the dollar. But if you go back to right prior to the war, it was 13 cents. Recently it was 13 in May, and it's dropped recently. There's reasons for that, but it's not because of the sanctions. It's, basically this is where Russia was for 2 years in 2020 and so on. And having a low dollar to ruble or a low ruble to dollar ratio doesn't really say that their economy is doing poorly. That might be a little bit counterintuitive, but one of the things that they're working on now with China is trade, trying to get more Chinese goods into Russia. If you want to buy a lot of Chinese goods, if you want to sell a lot of Russian goods to China, having a low ruble is good. If you want to buy a lot of goods, having a high ruble is better. So it's kind of like depending on what they want to do. So I'm not an economist, so I don't know all the ins and outs of this. But what they're saying is that having the ruble stable at about 1.5 cents per dollar is good, because that's the amount where they can trade, they can buy and sell, and it's easy for both sides to buy. It's not too much money on one side, and it's not too little on the other. Or not too much on one side, on both sides, or too little on both sides. Okay. So this is what I believe will happen in the next few months. Is I think that, let's look at a couple other things first, though. Let me see. If you just look up, Ukraine losing, right? Ukraine losing 4 to 5 men to advance a few hundred feet. If you looked at this a year ago, you wouldn't see anything about that. I'm going to go back a year, or I'll go back to the summer, and if we look at, do a little custom range here. Let's see, we'll go from 2021 to October 1st, 2022. If you were to look just in this range, right? Is Ukraine losing the war? Is Russia losing the war? A Russian loss. So even when I put in Ukraine losing, right? I'm going to do more of a narrow search here because there was a period of time from about, let's see. Is Russia losing the war in Ukraine? Okay. Why Russia is losing steam and Ukraine is gaining ground. Is Russia losing the war with Ukraine? All right. So that's just by putting in Russia losing back almost a year ago. You saw all these articles about how Ukraine was losing. But if you just put in any time now, okay, is Ukraine losing the war? Ukraine loses over 700 soldiers in a day. Big win for Russia. U.S. confirms Ukraine losing and fight back against Russia. So things are starting to shift. People are starting to say things are looking bad for Ukraine. Now let me make my point because I've actually gone on longer than I wanted to. But the point is this. What you're going to hear is you're going to hear people saying it's starting to look very bad for Ukraine. But people like Biden and the other war hawks are going to insist that actually Russia has lost. And what they're going to say is that Russia thought that they could conquer Ukraine, but all they got was just the Donbass and a couple of other pieces of land. And they're going to say that this land is worthless because the cities are destroyed and so on. And so that's the false narrative. Okay, I looked at all of Putin's speeches leading up to the war. Never once did he say, right, that there was never a time period for the special military operation. And he always said, we do not plan to occupy Ukraine. The 3 days to conquer all of Ukraine narrative is a Western fiction. In reality, what the Russians banked on was immediate talks, which began to happen in Belarus and Turkey until they were scuttled by the West. Even so, they stocked up enough supplies for a 3-year war to last until 2025. In any case, plans were made to ramp up its military industry that was still partially intact from Soviet times. Russia could have taken Donbass in 2014, but waited 8 years to prepare in cooperation with the BRICS countries for the inevitable sanctions and a Western-funded counteroffensive. These countries believe that the U.S.-NATO alliance is threatening Russia's security, economically and militarily, because of the U.S. and military because the U.S.-NATO has also been threatening China, Turkey, India, Brazil, the African Union, and the Arab League as well. Okay, so what I said here was that there's a certain point of time when people are going to realize that Ukraine lost, but our leaders, the neocons and the neoliberal war hawks, are going to continue to say that Russia lost because they planned to conquer all of Ukraine, but they just got some concessions. And what the concessions are going to have to be, Ukraine will never join NATO, and that the Donbass area, the Zaporizhia region, and also the Kherson region, at least part of them will become Russian. And the West will never recognize that, but they will agree. Someone will, either Ukraine or in their constitution or NATO itself, will agree that Ukraine won't be in NATO. And there will be a demilitarized zone at some point. Okay. I wanted to answer this. What event are you referring to? I mentioned this in my other video. What event are you referring to when you mentioned a lasting peace in the Middle East? Syria, which is a country that Russia was fighting for, was admitted into the Arab League on May 8th, which is also the day the Nazis were defeated in Europe and a lasting peace was achieved. So it's kind of like a symbolic day that they allowed Syria into the Arab League. So what that's saying is that the Middle East nations, they look at the West, especially Germany and NATO nations, as being Nazis that are trying to take over the world. All right. Although the United States still occupies a partitioned northwestern Syria and supports ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, the same group, terrorist insurgency, the war is quelled. There will be no invitations by Saudi Arabia and the other Arab League countries for NATO to launch new wars against its neighbors. So in the past, what happened is that Great Britain and America for the past 150, 200 years have always pitted one Arab country against another. And they did that to keep them weak so that they could keep up their influence in the area. The US and before that the British area used hybrid economic, political, and military warfare to gain control of the resource-rich Middle East. We backed coups and revolutions to put Middle East strongmen we deem bad actors and pariahs. And then we support the insurgent group to destabilize a more powerful nation until the nation we support grows too powerful. And then we switch sides and our former ally becomes the new pariah. The U.S. supported Iran against Iraq, right? That was when they had the Shah of Iran. Then we supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq against Iran. And then we supported Kuwait and the Saudis against Saddam Hussein. And then that created ISIS. We're fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And now we're supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda against Syria. All this was just in my lifetime. But it went back, 150 years prior to that as well. To the east, there were recent puppet regimes that the U.S. put in place in Pakistan and Thailand. Unfortunately, these are likely to become theories of new wars meant to destabilize the emergence of China and India. So this could go on like this forever, but what I believe is that BRICS will become a power, and at some point we will have a president that will decide, having endless wars is not profitable for economic trade, and it's bad for humanity. And what we need to do is sit down with BRICS and decide on how they can become the successor nations, including the United States, because the United States still has the most resources in the world. We still have the most influence in the world, but scale back the attempt to try to create dominance. And as John F. Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. If China or India or Russia or Brazil or Saudi Arabia are gaining influence, we should try to be at peace with them, and we should try to see that both sides can prosper economically from the relationship. There can be like a healthy competition, and at times there can be a little bit of what you might call, a little bit of, not strife as far as war, but a little bit of competition that's strident, let's say, but not, with the threat of war, especially not nuclear war. So just look for this. You're going to see in the coming months, people go from number 2 to 3. People are going to continue to say things are going bad for Ukraine. Then suddenly people are going to realize they were lied to, just like we were lied to in all the other wars that we've been involved with since Korea, essentially. Okay, that's my video for today. Just remember that every war is a psychological operation. Every war is a media warfare operation as much as a military and economic operation too. So the way to find out what's going on is to look at the maps, the different war maps I've shown you. Live Map UA is good. Also, the one I just showed you, Deep State Map, is another good one. And the 3 YouTube channels I would recommend watching are the Duran, just Duran, and then Judge Napolitano. It's called Judging Freedom. It's also on YouTube. And there's several others. I like to see anyone that has interviews with people like Douglas McGregor or some of the former CIA. Judge Napolitano has on a lot of former CIA people and people that were in the military that know what's going on, that don't toe the line of the White House. So this is my website. If you would like to help us with upcoming videos, books, articles that we're doing, you can click on the donate button and donate using your credit card or PayPal if you have one.